Well, welcome back to our strange tale of Lola Montez, Part 2. To begin with, we'll recap the end of Part 1. Accused of bigamy, Lola posted bond in a British court. Then she and her husband, George Heald, boarded a ship for France. In France, Lola and George had foolishly led an extravagant life. Heald's inheritance must have taken a hit. Plus, one would expect anyone marrying Lola would have a rocky marriage, and you guessed it, their marriage fell apart. In May of 1851, it was reported that Heald died by drowning. It was just a one-line statement with no explanation. On December 22, 1851, Lola arrived in New York. Her shipmate for the passage was Hungarian independence patriot Lajos Kossuth. Kossuth received a 21-gun salute. Lola was not a happy camper, as she was pushed off the front page of the New York's newspapers. She blamed her agent, Andrew Willis, for booking her on the same voyage as Kossuth. Lola griped to the press that in reality Willis was never her agent. He was just a broke fellow in Paris who asked for help. Her real agent was the Reverend Joseph Scoville. A reverend representing the scandalous Lola? Scoville was once the private secretary to the late Vice President of the United States. But there was no scandal here. Scoville's love of alcohol made him give up the pulpit long ago. As for Edward Willis, while he would become just a footnote, his brother was Nathan Parker Willis, one of the most noted authors of the era. Nathan didn't take lightly having the notorious Lola drag his brother through the gutter. Nathan published a scandalous article about Lola. The public catfight had its effect. Lola's debut on Broadway played to a packed house of 3,000 attendees. Of the attendees, only 30 ladies were in attendance. Tickets for a box seat sold for 4 times the usual cost of $24. For the next 18 months, Lola toured the eastern United States. She would perform her signature spider dance, plus perform a new presentation on her experiences in Bavaria. However, wherever Lola traveled, controversy was never far away. New Orleans, February 9, 1853. Maestro, we will need a different background music for our next segment. That's better. The Daily Comet newspaper in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, published the following article. Lola was accused of physically assaulting her maid. The maid escaped and sought help at the police station. The maid then took her brown paper parcel and with eloquent sobbing proceeded to the recorder's office and told a tale that moved the heart of the philanthropic old gentleman who forthwith dispatched with warrants to bring the pugilistic countess before him to answer for her conduct. The Knights of the Bastion proceeded to the residence of the countess and found her in an offensive attitude. She swore she would not be taken. With the words she drew from her bosom a dagger in whose blade her indignation flashed. She bade the Charlies stand back, and their knees for fear knocked together. But after a bit, whilst one was elating the point in front of the others, slipped behind her, and Lola Montes, the Countess of Lansfeld, was a prisoner. After the dagger was taken from her, at this juncture she ran to the sideboard, seized a small vial labeled poison, and before her hand could be arrested, swallowed the contents. Several apothecaries were immediately sent for and came in with stomach pumps and rat poison antidotes, but there was no use. The thing was did. Fortunately, the poison was a slow minister of death, and the Countess came to, smoked a cigar, drank a glass of sherry, and the only serious damage as yet discovered is the loss of buttons. A long line of admirers rushed into the room when the alarm was given, and their bosoms swelled with such indignation that their coat buttons would not retain. Orleans was not the only town where she generated bad press. Lola paid her bail, skipped town, and headed north to Cincinnati. Upset at what she thought was a blasphemous article, she invaded the Cincinnati newspaper's press room and wrote her own editorial in her defense. She signed the article, Marie de Lansfeld healed Lola Montez. How far could she travel to shake the negative press and to find an eager new audience to pay to see her dance? Gold-rich California called to her. Let us pick up as Lola, her manager, and her dog are heading to Nicaragua. Their goal is to cross the isthmus and catch a ship heading north to San Francisco. Also on the voyage to San Francisco was Mr. and Mrs. Knapp. The Knapps were acquaintances of Lola in New York City. The couple's destination was a small mining town called Grass Valley. The isthmus was only 47.6 miles wide, from Colón on the Atlantic side to Balboa near Panama City on the Pacific side. To cross, Lola would have had to take passage on the Panama Railroad. Unfortunately, in 1853, only 30 miles of tracks had been completed. At the end of the line, she would have then had to hire a wagon or ridden horseback over the uncompleted section over the summit. Once on the Pacific side, to complete the crossing, she then would be able to catch a second train covering the last miles to the west coast. The captain is about to raise the Northerner's anchor as Lola begins her last leg of her journey to San Francisco, seeking her fortune in the wild California gold rush. Lola knew her way around Europe, and after 2 years on the east coast of the United States, I'm sure she was comfortable with her travels here. But California was a whole new experience. Tales of lawlessness and vigilance committees hanging desperados filled East Coast newspapers. It was a sure bet that the very loquacious Lola was ready to meet and greet her fellow male passengers. On board, she was especially attracted to a young lawyer who hailed from Ohio, Patrick Purdy Hall. Depending upon which document you read, at the time he was either 32 or 37. Hull was an early settler in California. As a lawyer, he prospered and invested in the San Francisco Whig newspaper. Lola would later comment that what attracted her to Hull was that he could tell great stories. Being that he was part owner of a political newspaper must have also interested Lola. Remember, she had an affair with the French newspaper publisher Alexandre Dujarrier. Lola had one attribute when it came to men. She could multitask. Hull introduced Lola to another shipboard passenger, Sam Brannan. Brannan was an early California immigrant. In 1846, Sam Brannan sailed into San Francisco Harbor as leader of 238 Mormon saints. Their goal was to colonize Alta California, creating a new Mormon colony. Brannan, like Purdy, he owned a newspaper, the Alta. His investments in California would give him the claim as one of California's first millionaires. It did not take long before Lola and Sam became romantically involved, which did not help Brannan's marital situation. In the end, Purdy would win Lola's hand. Brannan, a LDS church leader, having earned great wealth in early California, would become an apostate. His eccentric life would end in poverty in San Diego. We'll save his tale for another time. On the Friday night of the ship's arrival, as the ship berthed at the Long Pier, there were no formal greetings, nor were there bands playing. However, the arrival of her passengers did not go unnoticed, for the Northerner's guest list was newsworthy. The Countess of Lansfeld, or more generally known as the Divine Lola, was a passenger on the Northerner. She comes unheralded, yet her arrival has produced great excitement among the quid nuncs of the Union Saloon. We hear that she will immediately enter upon her professional career. For those of you who are not acquainted with 19th century jargon, quid nuncs is archaic for a gossipy, inquisitive person. Just 6 days after her arrival, 147 miles northeast of San Francisco, in the very isolated Sierra Gold Rush town of Nevada City, the town's newspaper printed the news of Lola's arrival. Nevada City and her sister town of Grass Valley would soon learn a lot more about Lola Montez, but for now, our tale focuses on Lola and San Francisco. During the gold rush, Yankee was a popular nickname. Everyone seemed to have nicknames. To keep up with all the Yankees in the gold fields, San Francisco had to have their very own Yankee. Enter David G. Yankee Robinson. He was a university-trained doctor. In 1848, he settled in San Francisco, providing medical services as well as opening a drugstore. He was one of San Francisco's first aldermen and served as a member of the San Francisco Vigilance Committee. Dr. Robinson had a keen interest in the performing arts. To serve San Francisco, he built a 200-seat theater. Unfortunately, the theater burned to the ground. He rebuilt in grand style a new American theater, this time seating 2,635 patrons, with room for standing guests. He had an additional business providing entertainment to the miners in the Mother Lode. His performers traveled a circuit from San Francisco to Sacramento to Placerville. Lola's new love, Patrick Purdy, knew exactly who Lola needed to meet. Just 5 days after setting foot in San Francisco, on May 27, 1853, Lola was booked to perform in Robinson's newly completed American Theater. The theater was sold out. Lola's first performance was reading the libretto of 3 characters in an English opera named Maritana. From our tale of Lola, the plot of the opera might sound familiar. In a public square of the city of Madrid, a band of gitanos or gypsies are levying contributions on the populace in recompense for the songs and dances they amuse them with. With this tribe is a young girl of extraordinary beauty of person and a vocalist of more than common talent. The gay King Charles II of Spain has seen her and is smitten with her charms. Lola would not be Lola without performing her famous spider dance. San Francisco was not gender balanced, as males far outnumbered women. The beautiful Lola Montez pretending to shake off spiders was well received. In another performance, Countess Lola Montes Grafen von Landsfeld retold her side of the story of her days in Bavaria. In the audience, Dr. Yankee Robinson watched with keen interest Lola's performance. Robinson was an excellent scriptwriter as well as an excellent lyricist. Sitting next to him was Caroline Chapman. She had been a star actress on the Mississippi Riverboat circuit. With twinkles in their eyes, they both saw an opportunity to create a burlesque with Lola Montez, the butt of their humor. The following night, accompanied with the American Theater cast, they presented Who's Got the Countess? Later, a second satire was added, Lola Montez in Bavaria. The satires dredged up every rumor about Lola's past life and exaggerated her life in remorseless song and dance. To poke the needle even deeper, Caroline Chapman assumed the role of not 3 characters, as Lola had done, but did 7 roles.
She's gonna get her horsewhip.
Yes, we would have expected mercurial Lola to have grabbed her horsewhip and demanded an apology. However, since arriving in San Francisco and throughout her 2-week run, Lola had been a guest for 3 weeks, staying at the Robinsons' new home on Telegraph Hill. Mrs. Robinson had even graciously helped Lola repair her spider gown. Perplexed and disappointed, Lola questioned Dr. Robinson as to why the disrespect. He replied, "Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery." One reason for her restraint was the fact that Lola's performances, along with Dr. Robinson's burlesque satires, filled the theater. Lola's share of the gate was substantial. Or after 3 weeks of performing at the American Theater, Lola had something else on her mind. Another engagement at San Francisco's historic Mission Dolores Church. Or did you ever wish you could delve into someone's brain and ask why? Patrick Purdy Hull, lawyer and newspaper owner, why? The guest list, noted in the newspapers, included only Purdy's friends. No one from the American theater was listed. The ceremony was officiated by Padre Michel Accolti. Padre Accolti did not know of Lola's 2 previous marriages, nor her Protestant leanings. For their honeymoon, the newlyweds headed into the Central Valley. Lola's new husband loved hunting. At this time, the California Central Valley was an almost untouched Serengeti. Big game of bear, tule elk, deer, as well as game birds were present in abundance. News does travel fast and far. New York Tribune, 10th of August, 1853. Mr. and Mrs. Hall spent much of their time hunting in the valley. Lola was in search of new sensations, and for the moment, the bear seemed a more attractive quarry than the man. But before long, a German medical man named Alder, himself a mighty hunter, came across her path. Prowess excited her admiration, and he at once fell a victim to the shafts from her quiver. The honeymoon had to end, as Lola was scheduled to perform in Sacramento and needed to return to San Francisco in order to catch a ferry. Dr. David Robinson left California in 1857, never to return. During the 1906 earthquake, the American theater was destroyed, not to be rebuilt. Their son, Charles Robinson, however, became an accomplished artist. As our newlyweds head east, I'd like to show a few of Charles's paintings, scenes that Lola might have enjoyed as she traveled upstream, and later when she camped in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Lola was scheduled to perform 6 concerts in Sacramento. Lola and Patrick would have arrived early at the San Francisco Pier to catch the 8 a.m. ferry to Sacramento. Along with 300 passengers and freight, the 400-foot coal-burning sidewheeler christened Senator was scheduled to arrive in Sacramento at 8 p.m. Cost $25 per person. Upon arriving in Sacramento, the newlyweds found lodging at the recently built Orleans Hotel. Located just a few blocks from the pier, the 3-story brick hotel offered 40 bedrooms with parlors and the obligatory saloon on the main floor. On the following night, Lola was scheduled to perform with Miska Hauser, a renowned Hungarian violinist. Their venue would be the newly built Sacramento Theater on 3rd Street near J. Miska Hauser had been touring the East Coast when the call of California Gold called to him. He arrived in San Francisco 2 months before Lola's arrival. He was 31 years of age. San Francisco was small, and Miska had a chance meeting with Lola. His first impression of Lola? She is very naughty. Like a little child, she speaks about fire as if she had never been burned. Miska and Lola developed a friendship. They decided to tour together in the hinterland. And here they were, their first performance at the Sacramento Theater. The first night's performance all went well. Lola and Miska entertained at a benefit for the Sacramento's Hook and Ladder Company. Lots of laughter and applause. The second night's performance, things did not go as well. I'll let Miska tell what happened. It was the first time after her marriage she was to appear on the stage. The public in the town was dubiously expectant. All the tickets were sold out days in advance. Malcontent slandered her in the papers, songs about her, the repetition of which I would not care to be responsible for, were sung on the street corners. Everyone became tense towards the evening of the performance. The house was packed. The curtain went up. Lola came out like a fairy, stepped to the middle of the stage, let her bold, glittering eyes pause on the audience, and began to dance. A shrill, loud laugh broke the silence, a silence like the quiet before a storm. Lola signed with her hand. The music stopped. She walked to the edge of the stage and proud, erect, flaming eyes stood there. Ladies and gentlemen, Lola has too high an opinion of the people of California to consider of any importance the silly laughter of some simpleton. Let me speak, she demanded in a high-pitched voice, and her eyes flamed. Come up here, she continued. Give me your pants and take my petticoats. You are not fit to be called men. Lola Montez is proud to be what she is, but you haven't the courage to fight me, who is not afraid of you and despises you. All, I am a woman. She intended to go on, but the rotten eggs and apples continued until, for strategic reason, she backed out of the range of fire. I took the stage, said a few apologetic words. To make my words more effective, I took to playing the violin, playing as long as I could the craziest of things such as Carnival, Yankee Doodle, Bird in the Tree, and their shouts of joy converted that playhouse into a madhouse. Suddenly, the stubborn Lola appeared once more and danced her spider dance. The headstrong in the audience left, while others who remembered that they had paid to see Lola stayed and for their defection from the cause were well repaid. Under armed guard, Lola returned to her hotel room. Below her room, she was met with a serenade of catcalls, broken pots, pans, and noisemakers. Lola stepped out on her balcony. You cowards and bastards, I despise you more than stinking dogs. The armed guards finally broke up the crowd. Miska continued his story. When I visited her shortly after, she ran up to me laughingly. Believe me, dear Hauser, last night was worth $1,000. It was gloriously entertaining, and another adventure has been added to my list. Lola, her husband Patrick, and Miska packed their bags for their next presentation, traveling up the Sacramento River to Marysville. Marysville was much like Sacramento in that it could supply the needs of miners in food, mining supplies, and river and stage access to Sacramento with connections further west to San Francisco. Just east of Marysville were two important mining towns, Nevada City and Grass Valley. Today, both cities host California state parks dedicated to early mining. Marysville was unlike Sacramento. It was rather bored about Lola's presentation. The house was not sold out. Somewhere in the performance, Miska made a remark which Patrick took offense. That night in their hotel room, Lola and her husband had a fierce argument, heard by all who were near. One report had Lola tossing her husband's baggage out the window. Miska would leave the tour and head back to San Francisco. Lola would later accuse Miska of sending notes back to Europe, retelling the whole sordid story of their tour. Lola and Patrick caught a stage and headed east to Grass Valley. A month earlier, Patrick had sent a letter to their friends Mr. and Mrs. Knapp that they would be coming to Grass Valley for a visit. In March of 1897, Dora Knapp sat for an interview reminiscing about the early days of Grass Valley and their special friend, Lola Montez. The population there then was about 4,000, and a very large part of it were men. There were in Grass Valley at that time some of the finest families in England and on the continent of Europe. A dozen young men in the place were graduates of Oxford and Cambridge. The young men were nephews of Victor Hugo. The Countess was delighted with Grass Valley, the rough, rugged, romantic scenery among the mountains, the thorough democracy of the people, the witty and jolly young men. They purchased a cottage at 248 Mill Street, near Grass Valley's downtown. Here we have the newlyweds sitting in a buckboard in Grass Valley with a gentleman riding shotgun. With Lola's mercurial nature, nothing remains the same for long. Lola Montez and her new husband had not lived together more than a few months before trouble began. Dora Knapp continued her story. They were erratic individuals, never intended to be domestic. They went down to Marysville one day on business, and while there had a stormy scene about money matters, and because Lola still kept a correspondence with several men in Berlin and Munich, the upshot was that Lola actually pushed her husband out of the room at the Old Exchange Hotel at Marysville, pushed him downstairs and ordered him to leave the hotel on pain of his life. Then she threw his grip sack and some of his personal belongings out of the second-story window and told him to pack them and be gone. And when she came back to Grass Valley, she never mentioned his name except once when she told us about her sensational dismissal of Pat, as she called him. One more story concerning her divorce, which floated through Grass Valley. Mrs. Knapp did not mention this story. Lola was given a cub grizzly bear by Victor Hugo's nephews. I could not collaborate whether these gentlemen were or were not related to Victor Hugo. According to the tale, the bear bit Lola's husband Patrick. He in turn shot the bear. Lola was very sensitive about her growing menagerie of pets. She became enraged at what he had done and sought a divorce. There is no date as to when the divorce decree became official. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire destroyed all city records. What little we do know is that the German Dr. Adler, who Patrick and Lola met on their hunting honeymoon, was accused of having had an affair with Lola, and he was ordered to testify. Unfortunately, he could not, as he was either murdered or died in a hunting accident. The evening salons that the Countess Lansfeld introduced in Grass Valley were the most notable feature of her life there. It was not long thereafter the Countess became acquainted with the gentlemen of Grass Valley that her salons began. They were merely evening meetings of convivial and bright men at the cottage of the Countess, where someone suggested that they all needed to join in an adventure, a camping trip up into the Sierra. Grass Valley Telegraph, July 13, 1854. Off to the mountains. Quite a party started out this morning for a trip to the Sierra Nevada. Madame Lola Montez, Old Block, Dr. Delavan, and others from the company, in their intention to be absent 2 or 3 weeks. We'll need a quick introduction. Old Block was Alonzo Delano's pen name. In 1848, at age 42, he immigrated by wagon train from Illinois to California. His travels over the Sierra Nevada, being a newspaper reporter in San Francisco, and travels throughout the Mother Lode gave him a keen insight into early California. His investment in a quartz mine brought him to the new town of Grass Valley, where he and Lola would meet. He was a gifted newspaper satirist and author. He was as well known in California as Bret Harte or Mark Twain. If you mailed him a letter, just address it to Old Block. The post office knew exactly where to deliver it to. With high expectations accompanied with pack mules to carry their supplies, the expedition set out for Donner Lake, and the site of where the Donner Party spent their horrific winter of 1846-1847. Just 8 years had passed since the Donner Party had been rescued. Lola, Old Block, and the rest of the expedition explored the remains of the Donners' cabins, as well as viewing the toppled trees and stumps as the survivors had tried to make survival cabins. Up until this point, Alonzo had been enjoying himself hugely, as he put it. Even Lola's eccentricity added to the fun. Lola's behavior, it was felt, was caused by the high altitude. It was an especially cold night. In the morning, divine Lola let everyone know her rank. Having had enough of her diatribe, which Alonzo felt was directed at him, he packed his bags and headed back down the mountain. The party's cook also deserted. Likewise, it was agreed by the rest of the adventurers to break camp and head for home. About this time, it was noticed the pack animals had made the same decision, taking all the provisions for food with them. Unwilling to sacrifice a remaining mule for food, Lola endured a 24-hour fast, hiking back to Grass Valley. Back in Grass Valley, Alonzo Delano made sure that his pen name, Old Block, wrote a riotous tale of Countess Lola Montez' visit to Donner Summit and her escape back to Grass Valley. The story was picked up quickly by local newspapers. Like an epidemic, the story spread nationwide and even was picked up in European newspapers. Needless to say, Lola was not a happy camper. Now the story might have ended here, all but forgotten of an event which took place a century and a half ago. However, the stories of Lola Montes were retold many times. When it came time to name Sierra Nevada's topographical monuments, Lola was not forgotten. Not too far from where Lola and Alonzo's adventure began at Donner Summit, Lola's name is enshrined. The highest peak in Nevada County is Lola Peak. There are two beautiful alpine lakes named Upper and Lower Lola Montes Lakes, as well as the Lola Montez Road and Lola Montes Trail. I could find no record where on Lola's adventure to Donner Summit where the expedition named any lake or peak. In 1867, a survey map was created for the township and range. As you can see in this original survey map, Lola Montes Lake was simply called Small Lake. By 1949, there was a local tradition of referring to the lake as Lola Montes Lake. The 1978 Federal Board of Geologic Listings officially gave Lola her just due, Lola Montes Lakes. Her 2 years living in Grass Valley were for Lola much like taking a sabbatical. She did not make the news too often, but Lola had to be Lola. For one, Lola had not matched the stereotypical 19th century ideal woman. She was a chain smoker. As we have seen, she even enjoyed a cigar. She was not a submissive, shrinking violet. She wore her hair short rather than long. And of course her spider dance could be erotic, as when she raised her skirt, as one local newspaper reported, she took the rag off the bush, or in other words, gave the spy deer dance with extra touches to the infinite delight of the few admiring friends. All that was seen on the occasion has not been divulged. Of course, Lola's eccentric behavior did not go unnoticed by the local Methodist Church. Mrs. Knapp, in her remembrance, noted that the Reverend Wilson of the Methodist Church gave a Sunday sermon where he referred to Lola as a shameless devil in the guise of a beautiful dancer. The following day after the service, Lola put on a dancing costume and calmly marched over to the minister's front door and knocked. Upon answering the door, with the minister's wife present, Lola asked the stunned minister, "Tell me where the devilish existed." One account noted she even exhibited a short dance. A nice donation to the church soothed the minister's feathers. When a stranger bothered Lola's pet bear, Lola asked him to stop. The stranger yelled at Lola she could go to hell. Lola grabbed the rifle and chased the man down Mill Street, with the community looking on. Our town was thrown into a state of ludicrous excitement this afternoon by the appearance of Madame Lola Montez rushing from her residence through Mill Street towards Main Street with a lady's delicate riding whip in one hand and a copy of the Telegraph in the other, her eyes in fine frenzy rolling, vowing vengeance on the scoundrel of an editor. She met him in the Golden Gate Saloon, the crowd following her in her footsteps. Lola struck at the editor with her whip, contented himself with keeping most insulatingly cool. Finding all her endeavors powerless, the divine Lola appealed to the miners, but the only response rendered was a shout of laughter. Mr. Shipley, the editor, then triumphantly retired, having by his calmness completely worn out his fair enemy. While the incident was over in minutes, the story, like the other Lola's tales, were reprinted nationwide, even translated in Pennsylvania into German. Lola's antics were welcomed by newspaper editors throughout the United States as well as in Europe. However, there was another far less publicized story. She loved animals. Besides her pet bears, her home was also the home for chickens, sheep, and even a few monkeys. In old clothes, she worked her garden herself. She donated money for the care of sick or injured miners. In many ways, she gained the respect of the women of Grass Valley. She was not to be feared, but to be loved. As we have seen in part 1, Lola had a dysfunctional childhood. Sent to a boarding school at age 9, she would not have seen her mother until she was of marital age. From Lola's point of view, she never had a normal family remembrance. Maybe that is why Lola took a compassionate interest in children. Mrs. Matilda Uphoff, at age 83, recalled back when she was just 5 years old and was invited to Lola's house for a Christmas party. There were only a few girls in Grass Valley, and I remember when I was 5, Lola Montez gave us little ones a Christmas party at her home. We were all excited about it. If Lola had been the woman some say she was up there, our mothers never would have let us visit her. She met us at the door, and as we arrived, and gave each of us a merry welcome. I don't remember much about her looks except that she seemed to be the most beautiful woman in the world. And yes, she had a tree. I remembered that. And she had gifts for us, and we played games and had good things to eat. Practically next door to Lola's house lived the Crabtrees. Lola and Mary Ann Crabtree became close friends. Mary Ann would have Lola's back and would defend her in town. The Crabtrees had a young child named Lotta. Lola took Lotta under her wings, teaching her songs and dances. Lola even asked Lotta to perform for her guests. Soon Lotta Crabtree was performing on local stages, receiving positive reviews. A star was born. Lotta Crabtree could retire at age 45 as the richest American actress of the era. After 2 years in Grass Valley, Lola found her savings was slowly being exhausted. In addition, her spider dance had lost its novelty. As a result, her audiences were shrinking. Other younger ladies were replicating her spider dance. The mining industry was also changing. The entrepreneurial miner was giving way to industrialized operations with hired employees. To financially survive, Lola realized she needed a new audience. Coincidentally, with Lola's problems, a new gold find was discovered. With a retinue of 9 people, including herself, her maid, and her new manager, Frank Foland, who may have also been her new love interest, her troupe of performers set sail for Sydney, Australia on the bark Fanny Major. The voyage would endure 71 days and encounter a major storm which damaged a main mast and ripped sails. Like many men in California, her new manager, Frank Foland, had left his family to seek his fortune in California. They met in San Francisco, where Frank was a member of a troupe of actors. While many families would reunite, Frank's wife and 2 children would never see him again. Maestro, a little Australian folk music, please. They arrived in Sydney, Australia, August 16, 1855. She would then travel south to the new goldfields in Melbourne, Australia. At the Royal Theatre, before 500 attendees, Lola performed her spider dance. As she pretended to shoo away the attacking spiders, once again she lifted her skirt, leaving nothing to the imagination. Her suggestive spider dance was not well received. At the gold mining town of Ballarat, her performance received the wrath of the editor of the Ballarat Times newspaper. Lola showed up at the editor's office with whip in hand. The violinist Miska Hauser and Lola crossed paths. Miska found Lola in poor health, smoking a cigar. Lola had not forgotten that Miska had spread rumors about her. She petulantly walked through town, ripping up Miska's posters of upcoming performances, not once, but twice. Her performance in Castlemaine at first went well. Then a few hecklers began to mildly disrupt her dance. Lola unleashed an insulting verbal attack on the whole audience. When police were sent to arrest her for unpaid bills, I'm sure in Lola's mind it was time to return to San Francisco. On the voyage back to San Francisco, there were reports of loud arguments could be heard between Lola and her manager, Frank Foland. Foland was frustrated over Lola's antics. Near the Fiji Islands, Foland fell accidentally overboard or committed suicide. I guess it's fitting to have Miska Hauser play for us the last chapter of Lola's life. Lola returned to her home in Grass Valley. She stayed just long enough to sell her cottage and personal effects. She gave 5 farewell performances in San Francisco. On Thanksgiving Day, 1856, she sailed for New York City. Her goal was to recapture what was, but was no more. Lola's purpose in returning to New York was to recapture her past by making a successful comeback. Unfortunately, it was not to be. A lifeline was presented to Lola by the noted publisher, author, and writer Charles Chauncey Burr. He suggested that Lola make herself into becoming both a lecturer and author. As a result, with Burr's help, she traveled the East Coast and even returned to England. Time was not on Lola's side. While lecturing in England, Lola's health began to fail. A doctor diagnosed that Lola had advanced case of syphilis. She ended her tour and returned to New York. Back in New York, in failing health, Lola turned to a non-Christian form of spiritualism for guidance. One could only wonder which spirit of her past would Lola have wanted to communicate with. Was she asking forgiveness or just seeking guidance? Lola had a chance meeting with a childhood friend who urged Lola to turn away from the phony spiritualist and instead trust the Holy Spirit. She urged Lola to visit the Brooklyn Methodist Episcopal Church. Lola took her friend's advice and in her last months turned to prayer, scripture, and administering guidance to women at the Magdalene Asylum in New York. The asylums were established in England first. The New York Magdalene Asylum was a laundry sponsored by the Protestant Church. The goal was to offer prostitutes and women who bore children out of wedlock a safe place to live and work. News circulated quickly of Lola Montez's failing health. In England, Lola's mother booked passage for New York. As it turned out, her concern was not for her daughter's health, but to inquire into Lola's estate. In New York, she learned that Lola's net worth was only $300. Her mother left a few dollars for medicine and departed back to England. Suffering from syphilis, followed by a stroke and pneumonia, Lola passed away January 17, 1861. She was buried under her maiden name, Eliza Gilbert. With no family members present, she was laid to rest by members of her church. She was just 42 years of age. Protestant Episcopal Society published a pamphlet possibly containing Lola's last thoughts. How many years of my life have been sacrificed to Satan and my own love of sin. What have I not been guilty of, either in thought or deed, during these years of misery and wretchedness? Oh, I dare to think of the past. What have I not been? I only lived for my own passions. And what is there of good even in the best of natural human being? What would I not give to have my terrible and fearful experience given as an awful warning to such natures as my own? And yet when people generally, even my own mother, turned their backs on me and knew me not, my Savior came to the darkest sinner and brought a sweet light around me. Was Lola's confessions too hard on herself? Some authors have seen Lola as the prototype for the next generation of modern women. Women freed of the hypocrisies of the male-dominated Victorian age. Magdalena laundries imprisoned women for their sins, not men. Let me know your thoughts. It is time to roll the credits. Our last piece of music was composed by Franz Liszt. If you remember, in part 1, she had a wild love affair with Liszt. For the credits, I wish to honor Albert Denning, an Australian composer who was famous for just one composition. In 1855, upon Lola's arrival in Australia, Denning composed the Lola Montes polka. Denning did his homework by including in the polka Lola's signature act of defiance.
She's gonna get her horse whipped.
Presentation has been brought to you by the Dry Creek Conservancy, www.drycreekconservancy.org. Learn how you can help preserve our watershed. Also find us on Facebook. To view the complete collections of videos on either the American River or Sacramento watersheds, check out my website, www.youtube.com/user/MichaelStark1. Thank you.